So, what initially drew you into the world of politics?
The world of politics. I often joke that I have the DNA of a child of a politician. So I had no choice. But truthfully, I was heavily influenced by a father who was in politics for most of my life, really, most of my childhood for sure. My father was a city councilman and then the mayor of my hometown, Bainbridge, down in South Georgia. And then he ran for the Georgia House of Representatives, the Georgia legislature, when I was, I guess, about ninth grade. And so all through high school and college and beyond, he was a member of the Georgia General Assembly. So I had a front row seat to a lot of local level and state level politics that heavily influenced my interest in politics.
What was your experience like becoming the first female Secretary of State in Georgia?
Well, it was a great experience that I sort of lucked into, I guess, in some respects, because I had, after serving in the legislature, been offered the position of Assistant Secretary of State for Lewis Massey, who Governor Zell Miller had appointed Secretary of State. It was the expectation that Lewis would run for the office after having been appointed, but he, about a year and a half later, decided he would run for governor, and that left the seat sort of open, and people looked around and said, who would run for Secretary of State? And there were probably a lot of other people better positioned in terms of statewide name recognition and funding abilities, but I knew I could do the job better than maybe anybody else. I knew I was interested in it. I also knew no woman had ever run for it or held the job, and that would be a big hurdle. But I decided the risk was very much worth taking, and I jumped and raised over $1 million to do it. More money than any woman had ever raised in Georgia, and found my way into the Secretary of State's office for the following 8 years.
Now, you played a pretty big role bringing and introducing electronic voting to Georgia. So could you tell me a bit about that process? There are several false claims and conspiracy theories that have come about surrounding electronic voting since the 2020 election. So hopefully you could dispel some of those as well.
Do we have a few hours to talk about this? I could probably put your audience to sleep on this. But we moved into the world of voting with touchscreen voting machines after the 2000 Bush versus Gore presidential election, which I know predates many of our students being born. But in that election, which was so close, particularly in the state of Florida, the election results were almost paused while Florida had to count these hanging chads, and if you Google around, you'll see a lot of history of what it took to get the vote certified in the state of Florida. It took weeks, and everybody was sort of waking up to the idea that voting equipment in the United States was a mess, a really hot mess. And Florida had all of these old punch card voting devices and these chads that would fall out or not, depending on how you marked a ballot. And that was, in some respects, some of the turning point of the result totals in Florida. Well, while that was going on, I was Secretary of State, and I said, well, we need to look at what happened in Georgia. So we did a study during that time and found out, well, we knew in Georgia at the time, every county got to use whatever kind of voting equipment they wanted to use. And the truth of the matter was most counties had not spent a dime on upgrading voting equipment in half a century or more. So the majority of counties had really old voting equipment, the size of a refrigerator, mechanical units that were obsolete. The bigger counties in Georgia had the old punch card ballot, just like Florida had with its problems, and a few counties had moved into an optical scan system. But we did this study during that pause period waiting for Florida results when we found out that Georgia had lost about 94,000 votes for president in the 2000 election. But Bush had beaten Gore by more than that total. So even if we could have reconstructed all of those lost ballots, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. So the media really didn't care. But we, and me, I particularly was horrified to find out what a mess our voting system was. And I panicked about not wanting to go through another election without improving our voting system. So I lobbied the legislature in the next session that started the following January that we needed to study voting equipment in Georgia. And they put together a study committee for a year to study all of the voting options that were available. And that committee, made up of legislators, voting officials all over the state, recommended that we move to a uniform electronic voting system, and that the state purchased this for all of the counties so that we could get rid of all of this hodgepodge of equipment. So that happened really quickly, so that by the next election cycle, 2002, we were able to put in place the nation's first uniform electronic voting system in the country. Caltech and MIT did a study and said Georgia moved from one of the worst voting accuracy states to one of the 4 best after we improved our systems in 2002. And the truth of the matter is those punch cards were computers. So this was not the first time we moved into computerized voting. It was just the first time voters saw a computer. But it made people start thinking more about elections and how elections ran. But it certainly unleashed the conspiracy theorist who didn't understand not just how the equipment worked, but all of the security protocols we put in place to test the equipment, not just every time it's used, but test every piece of equipment, every single piece of equipment that is purchased and put in place in Georgia has to be tested to make sure no malware comes from a manufacturer. It's tested before every election cycle. There are all kinds of checks and balances from the check-in process to post-election day and things like that. Those are the things that give me the comfort level of the accuracy in Georgia's voting, both from the equipment I bought for 2002 and the replacement equipment that Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger has been able to upgrade. When I bought the equipment in 2002, there was no such thing as a paper receipt or a paper option. We talked about it. We knew that would be a good added value option, but it wasn't available in certified equipment back in 2002. Secretary Raffensperger got to add that so that now you touch a screen to choose your candidates, and then you get a printout so you can see it on paper, and we have a paper copy that can be hand counted, as he did in the last presidential election and state election, to do audit trails, which is a great security feature to have. So I'm very glad he's been able to add that, and that we now have that to add extra security to the system. So there is no perfect voting system. Let me say that. Let me give you an analogy. If I went out to Las Vegas and they gave me a slot machine that I could take home and tamper with, I could probably get it rigged to give me a bunch of quarters when I pull the handle on it. But I don't get to take that slot machine home. I have to use it in their secured casino, you know? It's a similar thing with a voting machine. If I gave it to you to take home, you could hack into it and insert something, malware or some way to make it manipulate the votes. But you don't get to do that. We have a testing system. You use it in a secure environment. It's stored in a secure environment. And that's why I'm comfortable with the security of the system. And so that's a big component people kind of forget. None of Georgia's voting equipment is now or ever has been connected to the internet. So satellites over Germany cannot radar down to a polling place and change votes. It's not connected to anything external that can be used to change the votes.
I'd also like to talk about youth engagement in the election and our electoral process, because there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation that floats around, and a lot of young people might be apathetic to the idea of participating in an election that they don't either fully understand or don't believe will benefit them in the long run. And I want to ask you, how can we go about bridging this gap and making sure that younger age groups feel empowered to participate in our electoral process?
Great question. Let me start by saying here at Georgia College and State University, I'm very pleased that our students seem to be more engaged than students nationally. And we've actually been recognized for that. Dr. Janet Hoffman in our communications department, it has been for many, many years our liaison to an organization called the American Democracy Project, which really works on getting students engaged in the voting process, nonpartisan organization. And we have been singled out for the last election cycle, the midterms in 2022. Georgia College students voted at a 5% higher rate than voters nationally, which I think is phenomenal. We've won awards for the rate of our students who register to vote as well as those who turn out to vote. So I'm pleased that our students are doing more than the average voter in the country. So that's a big plus. But historically, there's always been a knock on younger people. In fact, when I was serving as Secretary of State, the kind of marker used to be that 18 to 19-year-olds voted at about 18 to 19%, meaning about 18 to 19% of those people in that age group actually voted. And so when they voted at a low rate like that, candidates paid very little attention to them, because they wanted to vote for the 65-year-olds because 65% or 80% of them went to the polls, and so they could count on them as more reliable voters. I was very intrigued this year in the early voting period here in Georgia, in about the first 2.5 weeks of early voting, that about a third of the early voters were in the 18 to 28-year-old category. So that's a much higher rate of younger voters voting early. Now that, I don't know what the overall numbers will shake out to be, but that's a lot of interest in early voting by young voters, which I'm really excited about. A lot of the new voters that voted during the early voting period were younger voters, which is a big plus. So what that says to me is the message is getting out to younger voters that your vote matters, and there are issues that will affect you, because that's been feedback from younger voters for a long time of, nothing matters but Social Security when I'm 65 years old. Now students are hearing issues about abortion rights, birth control, family planning, higher education, student loan debt, things that really directly impact college-age students, and they want to have a voice, and they know their vote absolutely can be their voice. So I'm glad those kind of messages are cutting through, because it's true. Their vote will matter, and the candidates for president have very different viewpoints on those kinds of issues.
Another disconnect that seems to come up between younger voters and our electoral process is because of the age of federal officials in the government. Majority of federal officials are much older than people from 18 to 24, that age group. So how can that gap be bridged, and what could maybe be a rallying point to, again, engage that younger vote?
In the few conversations I've had around campus with students, I've been heartened, number one, to have students tell me, this is the first time I'm going to get to vote. That just warms my heart as a former Secretary of State, to know that students are excited about that big milestone in their lives to vote, and that they're taking it seriously. So I'm pleased that students are thinking about it. I'm always pleased when students are paying attention to the issues, because truthfully, all elections are about the future. They're about who's going to lead through issues in the future. It's not about the past. We're moving on from the past. And so having students give thought to what are those issues that are going to affect me personally, are going to affect my ability to get the jobs I want to get, to buy a house, to earn a living, to live where I want to live, to have the partner I want to have, to create the family life I want to have. Who's going to give me those opportunities? What policies will give me the opportunities to make those choices I want to make in my life? This is a really monumental election from a federal level in ways that I, in my lifetime, have probably never seen such differences of opinions between candidates on how we might go forward as a country. And so there are really consequential decisions that will be made in coming years. And I hope, I believe that students are paying attention to those things, and that their voices will really count a lot in the end.
So, being that we are on the cusp of Election Day, what would be your message to not only the campus community, but maybe the greater Milledgeville area or the state of Georgia as a whole before election night?
My message would be it's not too late to be thinking about the issues and thinking about the candidates. You know, there's plenty of good information on the candidates' websites. There is also plenty of misinformation out of there. If there's one thing we try to help all Georgia College students become, it's good, critical, independent thinkers. So, of course, don't believe everything you read on the internet about any candidate, because a lot of it is not just misinformation, a lot of it is truly AI and deep fakes that other candidates, media outlets are calling out. Even Secretary Raffensperger put out a statement this week about literal fake videos that have been put out describing Haitians claiming to have voted multiple times in Georgia, which he said is an absolute fake, made-up video, did not happen. So don't believe it just because your eyes saw it. Be a critical thinker. Dig for good information. Talk to people you can have confidence in, will give you good information, and find time to vote if you have not voted early. You can't vote early on Monday, but you can vote at all the polls from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Tuesday. And if you are in line to vote by 7 p.m. on Tuesday, they will keep the polls open until the last person votes. So if you have to go home to vote and you can't get there until 6:30 p.m., they will keep the polls open for you if you can get in line at 6:59 p.m. I promise you, you will get to vote. So make an effort to vote wherever you have to be on Tuesday to get in line at a polling place where you are registered to vote. You can check your registration on the Georgia Secretary of State's website. Easy to Google, easy to check your voter registration status. Go out and vote on Tuesday. Take your friends, encourage them to do the same. It would be so magnificent if the 18 to 25-year-old vote group turned out in huge numbers this year, because from then on, candidates would pay attention to the issues that really matter to them.
And just for one last thing at the end of the interview, could you give us a little WGUR sign-off?
Hi, this is President Cathy Cox, and you are listening to WGUR 95.3.